Welcome to this audio presentation of a prior private event at the Bank of England on the 16th of November 2023. Please note that this recording serves as a resource to support the visual material provided in the slide deck. However, it is only an approximation of the original presentation that was not recorded live. You can find the link to the slide deck on this webpage, which is found on the GCR website. Before we start, there are some minor differences in this version of the slide deck, including a few corrections and improvements and a full reference list at the rear. Secondly, the ideas presented herein do not necessarily reflect the views of the people who are referenced, or the Bank of England, or any other person or group. The GCR policy and the associated theory continue to evolve in dialogue with experts and key stakeholders, and later revisions of the policy and theory will reflect any changes and refinements. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the content of the presentation. In section 1, I'll introduce the problem of climate change to give context to the whole presentation. In section 2, I'll introduce the policy, global carbon reward. In section 3, I'll describe the financial mechanism of the policy. Section 4, I'll describe the central bank role in the policy. Section 5, I'll talk about the expanded theory to help justify the approach. And Section 6, I'll describe a few examples of how the policy will be used. And at the end of this whole presentation, you should have a general overview of how the policy works, and in particular, some understanding of the roles, mandates, and responsibilities of central banks. So let's begin with the problem of climate change. Here I would like to give a summary of the climate problem. Here I describe it as a Gordian knot. So the notion of a Gordian knot comes from ancient Greece. It's a fable or legend that Alexander the Great was challenged to untie an intractable knot. But rather than untying it, what he did was he just simply cut it with a sword. And the moral of the story is that we have a climate problem, a climate crisis, which is a Gordian knot of problems. And perhaps we're looking at this problem the wrong way, and maybe there is a resolution if we care to look at the problem differently. Consider first of all of the Gordian knot, the grave impacts and risks posed by climate change. So as you know, greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere, resulting in global warming. CO2 also acidifies the oceans, and this global warming is driving more extreme weather, droughts, floods, heat waves, so on. This is a major problem, not just for agriculture and human well-being, but also it will drive even faster biodiversity loss. In understanding the impacts and risks, which are really existential impacts and risks, I've included 5 references. So just very briefly, I'll go through these references as an example, as a way of simply giving more context to the problem of climate change. So reference 1 by the IPCC is the Assessment Report 6 Summary for Policymakers. It contains a lot of information, but one of the most important points is that if we exceed 2 degrees of global warming, there will be radically worse impacts and risks across the board. So it's highly important to stay below 2 degrees of global warming. Reference 2 by the IPBES illustrates or summarizes that we have a major biodiversity and ecological problem, a crisis, which involves extinction risk for about 25% of plant and animal species. About 1 million species face extinction. Reference 3 by Finn et al. Gives more detail in regards to animals. About 50% of animal species, they claim, are subject to population decline. 25% they claim face an extinction risk, and 1% have already become extinct. In other words, ecologists and biologists are claiming that we are entering or have entered the sixth mass extinction of species for the planet. Reference 4 by Headland et al. They did a study of some major grains in terms of global production and supply, and what they interpreted is that maize will be particularly sensitive to climate change, posing a supply risk to society. I just provide that as another example of the risks and impacts of climate change. Reference 5 is another important example by Facilio et al. The point here is that it might not be well known to many people in the financial services sector or central banking and so on that human beings could potentially experience humid heat that exceeds our ability to even survive. And this might come as some surprise, but human tolerance for humid heat has a limit. The upper limit is about 35 degrees Celsius of wet bulb temperature, and parts of the Earth that are densely populated could experience or will experience periods of unsurvivable humid heat. And this risk grows in magnitude, in duration, and geographic extent significantly if we exceed 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And so the point here is that billions of people are at risk to unsurvivable humid heat, and this risk increases dramatically. And that provides another context or reason to strongly respond to the climate change problem. Now let's look at the complex challenges of resolving this problem. I just came from COP28. It's now late December, but COP28 will be fresh in everybody's mind. And from that experience, we've learnt yet again that the intergovernmental agreements and responses of nation states and of corporates has been and will continue to be relatively incremental. However, incrementalism is in itself a part of the problem in the Gordian knot, because we need accelerated responses and accelerated change to have a chance of meeting the Paris goals. So a key point here is that there have been economic studies and assessments of the world economy that are constrained by stock and flow boundaries, such as the ability to supply renewable energy. And what these models have determined is that we would actually need a war-like economy to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, including much higher savings rate, subsidies, much higher subsidies investing for clean energy, and this would result in the crowding out of consumption, and it would also require a capping of total energy demand. So there are two references that are provided to give support to these claims. That's reference 6 by Jacques et al. And reference 7 by Dupont et al. I strongly recommend reading those papers and to pay attention to the key findings. Other studies published this year include that by the Hamburg Climate Futures Outlook, that's reference 8, and they determined that 1.5 degrees Celsius is not socially plausible because the social drivers do not support 1.5 degrees Celsius. What we're experiencing is incremental decarbonization, and corporate responses and consumption patterns globally do not take us to 1.5. Reference 9 by the Systems Change Lab says something similar. They point out that COP28 and COP meetings are important springboard for discussing new roadmaps. However, they also point out that incrementalism is our problem, and we're not accelerating towards an emissions trajectory that's compatible with 1.5. However, they do note, or they do make the claim that 1.5 is technically feasible. However, we need much more finance, scalable finance, and we would need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 or 60% by 2060 to avoid an overshoot of 1.5. And these carbon budget targets do appear to be unrealistic at this stage because of incrementalism and delayed response to the climate problem. Slide 1.2, climate tipping elements. What you're looking at is a diagram of known tipping elements that could be activated in the Earth system as global warming worsens. The yellow dots refer to those climate tipping elements that could already be activated or would be activated at relatively low levels of global warming, say below 2 degrees Celsius. That includes the Greenland ice sheet, West Antarctic ice sheet, tropical coral reef die-off, northern permafrost, abrupt thaw, Barents Sea ice loss, and Labrador Sea current collapse. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of this. If you're interested, you can read the paper by Alexander McKay et al. The point here is that I just want to emphasize to people who work in financial services, economics, central banking, and so on, that this climate problem we face includes the risk of positive feedback loops, which are called tipping elements before they're activated. And these feedback loops could be very profound, very dynamic, and could result in more emissions coming to the atmosphere from the Earth's surface that were not anticipated. Keep in mind that the models that are used for forecasting future scenarios, they don't necessarily have the true complexity to be able to predict or forecast what's going to happen with these tipping elements, which are highly dynamic and for which we don't have historical data to properly calibrate models. Slide 1.3, climate change may be accelerating. In the previous slides, I talked about the risks and impacts of global warming. I talked about the Gordian knot of the problem being very difficult to resolve through standard policies, and then I spoke about climate tipping elements. There is another problem that we also need to be aware of, which represents another kind of risk, and that is it's quite possible, according to the analysis of Hansen et al. 2023, that the science community may have underestimated the true sensitivity of the Earth system to greenhouse gases. So it's quite possible, according to Hansen et al., that they have underestimated the cooling effect of aerosol pollutions in regard to cloud dynamics, meaning that their models are not properly calibrated to actually forecast future global warming. And this new interpretation comes about in response to changes or reductions in sulfate aerosol pollution in the shipping sector and other sectors, and recent data that shows that the net accumulation of energy on the Earth's surface is increasing, has been increasing, particularly over the past decade. Now, this inference of Hansen et al. May be speculative. It might not be agreed by all the climate scientists. That's not for me to really judge. However, the point I want to make is that this represents a major systemic risk that we collectively could have underestimated the sensitivity of the climate system to greenhouse gases. On the right-hand side, we have a similar issue with methane emissions, because in the past decade or so, the methane concentration in the atmosphere has been increasing and accelerating, and scientists aren't entirely sure of why this is taking place, but the source of methane may be coming from wetlands, and so it's an open question as to whether we're facing an accelerated warming due to a new methane trend. The point being, once again, and I emphasize this for people in the financial services sector, central banking, and so on, that this problem of global warming is very much an interdisciplinary problem, and there are many facets to it, which generally speaking point to high impacts and risks which could easily get out of control. 1.4, financial regulators' view of systemic risk. In this slide, I would just like to set a context to the perspectives on risk in relation to various scenarios for the global carbon budget. So in this diagram, the chart, you can see it shows historical emissions of CO2 equivalent per year from 1990 onwards, and from 2023 onwards, we don't know, we can't actually predict where we're headed, but some of the more notable options are following policies that are currently implemented, which would take us to about 2.6 to 2.9 degrees Celsius of global warming, or if we fully implemented pledges, we might stay close to 2 degrees, or if we're Paris compliant, then in theory at least, we could achieve 1.5 degrees. Now, from the perspective of central banks, the Network for the Greening Financial System, financial regulators, etc., they have made announcements and written reports to define quite clearly the kinds of risks that they're concerned with. And the risks that they are concerned with are to do with financial stability. And hence they classify 3 kinds of risk: physical risk, transition risk, and liability risk, which relate to loss and damages, stranded assets, and legal claims respectively. The point of this diagram, or the slide, is simply to take note of that and to notice that physical risks will rise with worse global warming, transition risks could increase as we decarbonize quickly, and liability risks could go in either way depending on who's suing who. But we need to keep this in mind, because what this shows is that the financial regulator's view of systemic risk is actually very limited to the notion of financial stability. Slide 1.5, broader view of systemic risk. Here I want to point out very carefully and explicitly that I argue we need a broader view of systemic risk, and we need to bring this broader view into policies for central banks. The key difference here with this broader view is that I argue there is a whole other set of systemic risks that we could say are essentially risks to climate stability as opposed to risks to financial stability. So the climate risk is essentially upstream, dealing with the root causes of climate change, and the risks to financial stability are really just the symptoms or downstream impacts of climate change on the economy. If we look more closely at the risks to climate stability, we could break it down into various groups, but just for convenience, I propose these 4 kinds of risk. First of all, poor policy diagnosis. A lot needs to be said about that, because this whole presentation is essentially arguing that the mainstream economic community have incorrectly diagnosed the climate problem, the market failure, by not accounting for systemic risks properly and being limited by the neoclassical theory of anthropogenic. I could talk more about that later. But that would be an example of poor policy diagnosis, which then leads on to an incomplete or ineffective policy toolkit. Depending on what policies we actually implement, that will play a major role in determining the socioeconomic outcomes and the emissions that civilization produces. So if we follow a dangerous socioeconomic pathway, then we're going to have very high risks and impacts for the climate system, and we'd have climate instability. It only makes sense. Now, for climate change itself, I argue that we need to break it down into risks associated with the carbon cycle to do with uncertainty and feedbacks on the fast carbon cycle. And then we need to consider that the climate itself is more complex than the carbon cycle, because the climate also involves other factors such as changes in albedo. And so hence in this diagram I put forward a 4th kind of risk, which I describe as climate uncertainty and feedbacks. So collectively, if we take into account the risks to climate stability on the left, and on the right we have the risk to financial stability as I described earlier, what I argue for is that we need a more integrated and comprehensive approach that deals with both kinds of risks. Part 2, Introduction, Slide 2.1, Expanded Theory, Carbon Pricing Matrix. This slide is provided to give a background to the theory for the global carbon reward policy. The argument I put forward is that we can expand the theory on carbon pricing to provide a positive argument or positive theory for justifying the application of the global carbon reward. The alternative would be to offer a normative theory. However, given that the implications of the policy are so great for the economy, it's important for us to understand scientifically why we would implement a global carbon reward, and thus this effort has been put into providing positive theory. So the carbon pricing matrix, what it is essentially, is a matrix of the two major options for the store of value and the unit of account of instruments that are used to price carbon. Given there are two major options for both, it results in the 2x2 matrix, and my claim is that there are four major ways to price carbon as four distinct social agreements. The left column, which falls under fiat, refers to regular carbon taxes and carbon subsidies, and these are essentially Pigouvian subsidies and taxes and associate with Arthur C. Pigou's theory on positive and negative externalities and social efficiency. On the right-hand side, under carbon, these policies will require the introduction of a new tradable instrument with carbon units and carbon mass. The cap and trade policy is well known, of course. It uses an emissions permit, which is provided by government and sets the cap on emissions. And then these permits are traded by polluters, where polluters with excess permits sell to polluters with insufficient permits. And this trading is explained and understood in terms of theory of Ronald Coase, Coasean bargaining. Now, the point here is that if we introduce a fourth policy that offers carrots, positive pricing, it can also have a tradable instrument, which I'll introduce later, and that is how we come to the notion of the global carbon reward. Technically speaking, this new policy can or should be called a mitigate and trade policy. I'll talk more about the carbon pricing matrix and the theory later in this presentation. Let's move to slide 2.2. The policy is called a global carbon reward. It's a new international climate policy for establishing enhanced economic cooperation for the long-term management of the anthropogenic carbon balance. The new policy is framed by a risk management approach. The main objective of the policy is to achieve a relatively safe carbon balance in terms of the quantity of carbon that is reduced and removed, i.e. mitigated, and in terms of the quality of co-benefits that are provided for communities and ecosystems. Slide 2.3, policy type. As I mentioned previously with regards to the carbon pricing matrix, the global carbon reward is the world's first example of a mitigate and trade policy. It is a mitigate and trade policy because it employs a carbon currency as the tradable asset or instrument, whereby the carbon currency represents mitigated carbon. Mitigate and trade is theoretically related to cap and trade, which employs an emissions permit as the tradable asset. Slide 2.4, policy scope. The global carbon reward is a proactive climate mitigation policy. It's an international policy that can fund atmospheric carbon removal that will be essential for a safe carbon balance. It will finance a clean energy transition that is strategic, global, rapid, and orderly. It will adjust the rewards to match the emerging climate situation, and that's in reference to the risks that were described in part 1 of the presentation. It will also leverage human cooperation with a carrot and stick approach, meaning that we're not looking at this policy in isolation. It's supposed to be implemented in combination with the other market-based policies and non-market-based policies to provide a full carrot and stick approach. Slide 2.5, governance for speed and scale finance. This diagram gives an overview of the governance model for this policy. As you can see on the left, we will need a new United Nations institution, which is notionally called a Carbon Exchange Authority. It's responsible for issuing the instrument called a carbon currency with the code XCC, so it creates the XCC supply. It will use universal standards that will be agreed by scientists from around the world. By supplying the carbon currency into the mitigation market, we essentially create a new global reward market for climate mitigation. The new asset will then be traded into the foreign exchange currency market, where demand will be generated. So if demand is created in the Forex market and supply is created by the Carbon Exchange Authority, a price can be discovered. Important is that the carbon currency, the new financial asset, will not be used for carbon offsetting. This makes the carbon currency distinctly different to regular carbon credits and carbon offsets. We don't need carbon offsetting because demand will be created in Forex markets, and therefore the Forex market will fund the mitigation experience. For the Forex market to have demand that's reliable and long-term, there's a requirement for new central bank mandates where central banks collectively provide a guarantee for what's called the carbon currency floor price. Through this mechanism, which I'll describe later, we end up with debt-free finance for climate mitigation. Slide 2.6, Instrument Type and Utility. The instrument of the policy is called a carbon currency, as I already stated, with the code XCC. The XCC is a market tool for pricing strategically important mitigation, not just every kind of mitigation. It is a commodity currency with its own international carbon standard. It is a tradable asset that will be regulated as a commodity, and it's an investable asset with a safe haven status because it has limited risk. The risk is limited because of the central bank public finance guarantee, which I mentioned earlier. Furthermore, the XCC is not a carbon credit, so it cannot be used to offset emissions, and it's not a medium of exchange, so it cannot be used to make purchases. It's purely a financial asset. Slide 2.7, Carbon Currency, XCC. The unit of account of the carbon currency is defined explicitly as 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent that is strategically mitigated for a 100-year duration. There are technical reasons for this unit of account. I won't explain them all here and now, but some key points about the unit of account are that the currency will be proposed under the ISO 4217 standard for currency codes. The currency is analogous to a precious metal currency, and there are some examples in existence, including XAU for gold, XAG silver, XPT platinum, and XPD palladium. XCC is not a medium of exchange, as I mentioned. It's not a carbon credit. It cannot be used for offsetting, as I already mentioned, and it's not a security or a cryptocurrency. Slide 2.8, Carbon Currency Technical Clarification. This slide is presented to clarify what is meant by strategically mitigated for 100 years as the unit of account. So the phrase strategically mitigated has a specific meaning in this policy. What it refers to is mitigation that is acknowledged and included in the International Plan for Mitigation under the auspices of the Carbon Exchange Authority. So this policy will not reward every kind of mitigation. It only rewards that which the authority believes is strategically important to achieve the target of a relatively safe carbon balance. Now, there are 2 kinds of mitigation, generally, that fall under this category. The first is that from removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, carbon removal. And so that tonnage can be described as actual mass removed from the atmosphere. It's tonne for tonne. However, with conventional mitigation, which implies reducing emissions or avoiding emissions, there's a requirement to have a more flexible approach for flexible carbon pricing, and this is achieved through the inclusion of bespoke formulas for baseline emissions. I'll talk more about this later in the presentation because there's a nuance to this to understand how the policy deals with both additionality and providing appropriate price signals for industry to make changes without overpaying or underpaying. So in summary, at this point, I'll just say that strategically mitigated carbon includes actual removed from the atmosphere and notionally reduced through conventional mitigation. The 100-year planning horizon is also important, and this period of time was chosen based on the time it takes for greenhouse gases to result in global warming, and also it's approximately the duration of time that civilization needs to prepare itself for large-scale activities, large-scale projects that can take decades to implement. It also gives a price signal so that industry, corporates, and so on can plan for and innovate new technologies. In a sense, you might say it's a cause and effect response at the civilizational level based on forward-looking 100 years. Slide 2.9, carbon reward definition. Here I define what a carbon reward is for clarity, as opposed to what the carbon currency is. So the carbon currency is the instrument, and the instrument alone doesn't tell us the value of mitigation. The value is actually provided through currency pairs or exchange rates. So the carbon reward by definition are exchange rates, where we compare the value of the carbon currency relative to other currencies that already exist in the foreign exchange market. Slide 2.10, carbon reward examples. As I explained in the previous slide, the value or the carbon reward is defined by exchange rates, otherwise called currency pairs. And 4 examples are provided, currency pairs for the US dollar, euro, British pound sterling, and Chinese yuan. So if you take note of these exchange rates, what's important is that these exchange rates actually have the units that are of interest to businesses and project developers, because they're quite clearly giving us the value of providing strategic mitigation services for 100 years. So for example, if you're in China, the Chinese yuan per ton CO2 equivalent strategically mitigated for 100 years are the units for the carbon reward in that region. Furthermore, it should be noted that the carbon reward can be quoted in other currencies, not just hard currencies. There's nothing preventing the carbon reward being quoted in any currency in the world. Section 3. Let's have a look at the financial mechanism for the policy. Slide 3.1. Financial mechanism for carbon rewards. This is a very important slide because this slide explains the financial mechanism, the creation of the carbon currency XCC, call it the primary market or the supply market, and it's also comprised of the demand side or the secondary market, where the carbon currency is traded in the foreign exchange. So let's have a look at this step by step to understand the policy better. First of all, at step 1, we will need a new institution. Notionally, it's called the Carbon Exchange Authority. Ideally, it would be established under the United Nations, and it should have standards for measurement, reporting, verification that are universally acceptable. It will have standards that are developed for every sector, every industry as required. And these standards and the requirements will be written into service level agreements. The project investors or the project owners, before they can earn carbon currency for mitigation services, they will need to sign on to a service level agreement, which is a long-term contract. For the Carbon Exchange Authority, those service level agreements are its assets, and when it creates and issues carbon currency, the XCC is recorded as their liability. So that's step 1, the issuer. Step 2, the awardees. They receive the carbon currency according to the service level agreement for their mitigation services. When they want to realise the economic value of their carbon currency, for example, to pay down debt, to buy new capital, to pay wages, and so on, they will need to trade their carbon currency for a local currency. To do that, they will sell it into the Forex market. They will sell their carbon currency to whomever wants to buy it. Generally speaking, it will be the private sector that buys the carbon currency in what we might call the secondary market for XCC, or the demand side. Now, if there is not enough private demand for the carbon currency for any reason, then central banks will step in as the buyers of last resort. They will do this according to a protocol that will be set down as part of the policy. And the central banks will purchase the XCC off the open market. That will be recorded in their ledger as an asset, and then they will issue new bank reserves as their liability. For example, the European Central Bank will create and issue euros to purchase their XCC, and so on and so forth for other central banks. This process may be called strategic quantitative easing or carbon quantitative easing. Important about this process of money creation is that it will be internationally coordinated according to a specific protocol under the policy, and I will describe that process later in this presentation. Just as a final comment, it's important to understand these 4 steps: the primary market for supply, the secondary market for demand, and how the supply and demand will be used to generate a price in open markets. Slide 3.2, 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario for carbon reduction and removal. In this slide, I would like to focus our attention on the global carbon budget for human civilization for the next 80 years till the end of the century. I'm sure you've seen charts similar to this before. Essentially what it's showing is the total allowable emissions for 3 different scenarios. According to various reports, the world currently has a set of policies implemented that could take us to approximately 2.6 to 2.9 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. If we took into account all pledges in the world, possibly just up prior to COP28, those pledges and policies potentially could take us to 2 degrees Celsius. And we're definitely not in a situation to achieve the Paris-compliant 1.5 degrees Celsius. Nonetheless, if we focus our attention on the chart, you'll see that to achieve the 1.5 objective, we would need to reduce or mitigate the blue zone. In addition, because of residual emissions, which are shown as the grey zone, we would need to also remove a very significant amount of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. That's one key point for this particular slide, to make that abundantly clear, that we need to reduce a huge amount of greenhouse gases from the economy and also remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere to have a chance of achieving 1.5. From an economics perspective, standard economics says that we should implement carbon taxes. There are various estimates of the ideal tax. One such estimate is about $40 to $100 per tonne prior to 2030. There are other estimates that are significantly higher, and certainly throughout this century and beyond, the carbon tax would definitely have to rise higher than $40 to $100 a tonne, much higher. In addition to the fact that the carbon taxes are missing, or we have globally averaged relatively low prices on carbon. I think it averages at around $3 or $4 US a tonne globally. So we understand that the conventional approach is difficult to implement. It's not really delivering. It's not reliable. It's not effective. Another way to look at this problem is the climate finance gap. So various estimates place the missing finance at about $3 trillion a year in the short term for conventional mitigation, which would reduce global emissions as illustrated as the blue zone. Furthermore, we would need, roughly speaking, another $1 trillion a year to fund the carbon removal that we would need, which is shown as the red zone. So the important point here is that this is just a scenario for 1.5. The global carbon reward doesn't necessarily have to target 1.5. However, it would need to be calibrated to target some temperature scenario to some level of confidence. so that we can evaluate the amount of money to be spent on carbon removal and conventional mitigation. Slide 3.3, reward rules for reduction and removal. In the previous slide, I pointed out that we have a climate finance gap of roughly 3 trillion per year for reductions and roughly 1 trillion per year for removals, shown as the blue zone and the red zone respectively. The way the carbon reward policy addresses this problem is that it offers carbon rewards or carbon currency for mitigation services under 3 rules. Rule 1 for cleaner energy, Rule 2 for cleaner business, and Rule 3 for carbon removal. The first 2 rules, cleaner energy and cleaner business, refer to conventional mitigation, and Rule 1 is specifically aimed at the supply side of energy, and Rule 2 is aimed at the demand side of energy. Important about Rules 1 and 2 is that the way that the pricing of the reward is designed is that it will be highly flexible so that we can target the price points that are sufficient to change the behavior of market actors. Another key idea in this policy with regards to Rules 1 and 2 is that these 2 rules will be applied strategically. And what that means is that people who work for the Carbon Exchange Authority, the people who are responsible for applying the whole policy, they will do very careful assessments and analyses of the world energy market to strategically decarbonize with these reward rules both the supply and the demand of energy in such a way that supply and demand stay relatively in balance. The strategic objective here is to try and decarbonize the world economy without causing disruptions to energy markets, unnecessary disruption. So by reducing both supply and demand of fossil fuels, it's anticipated that the price of fossil fuels and other energy types will remain more stable. So that's some key ideas behind the notion of flexible pricing and strategic mitigation under Rules 1 and 2. For Rule 3, that particular part of the policy is very important because it structures the price signal and it funds carbon removal. The carbon removal rule, Rule 3, will establish a global marketplace for carbon removal services for every country in the world, ideally. Later in this presentation, I'll explain how Rule 3 actually structures the price signal and the whole policy. So let's move on. Slide 3.4, reward rules for strategic mitigation. In this slide, I'd just like to give you an overview of the various technical details that are important to Rules 1, 2, and 3 for funding and financing mitigation. First of all, Rule 1 for cleaner energy, it only rewards reductions in emissions. Rule 3 only rewards removals from the atmosphere, whereas Rule 2 rewards both reductions and removals. The implications are that under this policy, energy companies under Rule 1 cannot earn rewards for taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and that's to avoid a moral hazard. The other implication of this approach is that the businesses and companies that do earn rewards for carbon removal under Rule 3, they will be specialized businesses where they focus solely on carbon removal. Rules 1, 2, and 3 also have details which you can read about in the policy white paper with regards to Scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions and whether or not the rewards take into account investments and offsetting and how significant tests for Rules 1, 2, and 3 are managed. In this presentation, we won't look at those details. However, a point about these reward rules is their macroeconomic effect. Rule 1, importantly, will be used to manage asset exchanges for cleaner energy which I'll describe later in the presentation, and the purpose of these asset exchanges is to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Rule 2, it will be used to provide flexible pricing, as I said earlier, for decarbonising different sectors of the economy that are non-energy sectors and different industries. Rules 1 and 2 will be used in a strategic way together so that we can balance energy supply with energy demand to stabilise prices for both fossil fuels and other kinds of energy. One more point that I would like to make about Rules 1, 2 and 3 for strategic mitigation is that the price signals that are created with these rules will be vitally important to projects and investors because the carbon currency will be regarded as a bankable asset that can be reported in financial statements and which are underwritten by central banks such that it will attract a lot of confidence in the economy and in the markets for investing in mitigation projects. This will attract a huge amount of money to research and development across the board, such that over the long term, the cost of mitigation, providing cleaner energy, cleaner business, and carbon removal, should fall more quickly than would be the case without this policy. Slide 3.5, XEC floor price, calibrated for minimal carbon removal that is relatively safe. In this section of the presentation, we need to pause for a moment and reflect more deeply on the financial mechanism. Many of the people who are watching are probably asking themselves, how could the central bank guarantee for the carbon currency not result in large amounts of inflation through money printing? The answer to that question is really addressed with this price signal, which is a natural price signal for carbon removal. The way it works is that under Rule 3, we're going to calibrate a prescribed, targeted carbon reward price over the long term. Technically speaking, over a 100-year rolling period. So in the year 2020, we would set the carbon reward price for 100 years into the future, as shown in the diagram. The thick black line is the calibrated price for the carbon reward under Rule 3. And so to estimate or compute that reward price, we first need to decide on how much mass of greenhouse gases needs to be removed from the atmosphere on an annual basis and how much that would cost approximately. When those factors are included in an analysis of carbon removal, the result will be a reward price like that shown in the diagram, the thick black line. This is a preliminary estimate of the carbon reward price under Rule 3, and it is also called the XEC floor price or the carbon currency floor price. Here we're illustrating the floor price with the XEC US dollar currency pair, given that the US dollar is currently the world reserve currency. When certain variables such as technological innovation are taken into consideration, and starting with a low price and rising to promote the notion of least cost mitigation first, we end up with this style of reward price under Rule 3, and noting that the minimal carbon removal is that which would be essential, assuming that conventional mitigation is actually implemented at full scale under the other rules and with other policies that exist in the marketplace and through government regulation and so on. So once we can agree on the minimum rate of carbon removal that's required and to avoid a moral hazard, then we simply do an analysis to estimate this floor price as shown, as illustrated. If the actual market price of the carbon currency falls below the floor price, then central banks will step in with a protocol for buying up some carbon currency to the level that returns the spot price to above this floor price. What's important to note about the floor price, which is a natural price signal, is that the value of the carbon currency or the reward will rise over time, over many decades, probably until around 2060 to 2080. It will then peak and then begin to fall gradually as a result of technological innovation primarily. Therefore, with the public finance guarantee, the carbon currency actually becomes an investable asset. Slide 3.6, XCC floor price adjusted heuristically to reflect costs and risks. So in this slide, I want to point out that the floor price over the long term, over that rolling 100-year period, is not a static price. This is because there are many factors influencing climate change, both exogenous to the economy, to do with climate feedbacks and so on, the various risks that were described in the first section of the presentation. And then there are factors internal to the economy, such as what policies are actually implemented and how strongly they're implemented. So the point is that looking forward to the long term, there will always be uncertainty about the ideal floor price. The policy itself, over periodicity of perhaps 1 year to 5 years approximately, the floor price will actually be revised by the Carbon Exchange Authority. As such, there is uncertainty about the floor price into the long term. And this uncertainty is not a negative for the policy. It's actually necessary to acknowledge that there will be emergent costs and risks into the future. Slide 3.7, XCC floor price, guiding and supporting markets for the long term. The point of this chart, which shows the same XCC floor price, is that when the policy is actually implemented, there are more technical details regarding the setting and communication of the floor price. So, for example, this particular version of the chart assumes that we are in the year 2045. In the year 2045, we can look backwards to the historical spot price of the carbon currency or the carbon reward, as illustrated. For the future, from 2045 onwards, there will be a period of time of roughly 10 to 20 years where the floor price will be fixed or guaranteed. The reason being is that industry requires some sort of guarantee where they can be certain that they're going to receive a minimum floor price for their carbon rewards, their carbon currency that they earn. Hence, the policy includes this notion of a 10 to 20 year forward-looking guaranteed period of floor prices. Beyond the guaranteed period, for the longer term, for 100 years rolling forward, the Carbon Exchange Authority will also publish XCC floor prices as forward guidance. And that forward guidance will include an average estimate of the XCC floor price, an upper estimate and a lower estimate to take into consideration the various factors, uncertainties and risks related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Slide 3.8, XCC price discovery. In the previous slides, we went through the financial mechanism, the supply side and the demand side for our carbon currency. And here we're just going to summarize the key points for carbon currency supply and demand. On the supply side, the XCC supply will be controlled by universal standards and long-term agreements called service level agreements that will be managed by the Carbon Exchange Authority. That authority will also include other accountability mechanisms for transparency and so on, and guidelines for all market participants. The assessed mass of carbon that is actually removed from the atmosphere will be recorded and made transparent to the world. The carbon rewards and generation of XCC under Rules 1 and 2 will be such that the amount of XCC will align with the amount of finance that is needed to target the emissions reductions that we need to achieve our climate objective. In terms of XCC demand, the XCC will attract private investment demand because the currency will be backed by major central banks with that predictable long-term XCC floor price. With the floor price, the XCC will be viewed as an investable asset with limited risk, and thus it might be said that it has safe haven status. The carbon currency will not rely on carbon taxes or carbon offsetting for revenue generation or price setting, and that will help de-risk the entire carbon market for achieving net zero emissions. Part 4, Central Bank Role. Slide 4.1, Implications for Central Banks. So quite clearly, the global carbon rule policy has implications for central banks in terms of their mandates, expanding their mandates, and bringing in new policy and new protocols to address the climate crisis. So in summary, we could say that the global carbon reward policy requires new or expanded mandates for central banks so they can defend the XCC floor price with a public finance guarantee. This implies that they will help governments and the world proactively respond to climate change in a globally coordinated fashion. The central banks will effectively employ a strategic form of quantitative easing called carbon quantitative easing. The reason it's strategic is because it's a long-term quantitative easing protocol. It doesn't happen simply in response to some financial crisis over the short term, and it's computed and managed with formulas and a protocol. Furthermore, the GCR policy does not require central banks to assess mitigation projects, so central banks are not overloaded with new technical obligations to understand the minutiae of climate mitigation and technologies. That would simply be unreasonable. The central banks do not issue the carbon currency, nor do they manage the XCC ledger, which is actually held by the Carbon Exchange Authority. And finally, central banks are not limited in terms of their other policies and mandates. They simply need to follow a certain protocol for the GCR policy, and they can continue to develop, implement, and manage all their other policies and responsibilities as they would normally. Slide 4.2, XCC floor price, driver of investing and cost sharing that is Pareto optimal. So here we are looking at the floor price again, and just to remind ourselves, the orange squiggly line represents the spot price for the carbon currency in the foreign exchange market. So the spot price is a function of supply and demand, and it will always exceed the floor price, which is shown as the thick black line. If at any point in time it falls below the floor price, central banks will buy it up under the protocol called carbon quantitative easing. Now, the key idea here is the notion that this floor price is actually the forcing function or the driver of investing and cost sharing into climate mitigation. Given the fact that market actors are allowed to trade the currency as they please, the outcome of this particular approach should be Pareto optimal in a similar way that trading emissions permits in cap and trade would be Pareto optimal. However, here, at some point during the century, it's quite plausible that the total demand in the private sector for the carbon currency might be insufficient to keep the spot price above the floor price. That is, demand might be saturated, and then central banks will have to play a more dominant role or a more active role through time by continually buying up some of the carbon currency. So let's think about this in regards to what might happen in the future. Slide 4.3, hypothetical XCC finance for climate mitigation. In the previous slide, I alluded to the idea that at some point in time during this century, central banks may need to become major buyers of the carbon currency to keep the spot price above the floor. To explore this concept, let's consider an assumed scenario as shown in this chart of the economic value issued to mitigation projects as XCC. So this chart on the y-axis is labeled in the trillions of US dollars equivalent from 2020 to the year 2120. In this assumed scenario, the amount of money that's issued with XCC on an annual basis is shown as red for conventional mitigation under rules 1 and 2. And the amount of economic value transferred to projects for atmospheric carbon removal under rule 3 is shown as blue. Importantly, this assumed scenario is approximately correct in terms of the magnitude of XCC that will need to be issued to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius ambition of the Paris Agreement. So we can use this assumed scenario to explore the role of central banks. Slide 4.4, hypothetical XCC holdings for cost sharing. Using the data that was presented in the previous slide, the hypothetical or assumed scenario, we can now look at the cost sharing that would be or could be realized under this policy, keeping in mind that we're targeting the private sector to purchase and hold the carbon currency as a long-term investment with limited risk. However, at certain points in time, the private sector might not want to purchase the carbon currency in sufficient quantities to keep the spot price above the floor. For this reason, central banks may be required to purchase carbon currency over time at a changing rate. In this chart, the purple line is the assumed amount of carbon currency that central banks purchase throughout the 100-year period. With this assumed scenario, we can look at the numbers as rough numbers to get a feel for how much carbon currency will be purchased by central banks and how much bank reserves they will need to create and issue to trade for carbon currency in the foreign exchange market. In this assumed scenario, central banks create $77 trillion worth, US dollars equivalent, for this period, and the private sector purchases approximately $256 trillion worth of carbon currency. Slide 4.5, central bank purchases of XCC, achieving international equity with carbon QE. In this slide, I want to stress the idea that the sharing of the purchases of carbon currency amongst all the central banks will be determined through a formula. The formula is shown on the right-hand side. It's quite straightforward. For every time interval, there's an S total, or a total amount of XCC purchases that are required, and this is then shared to each central bank, denoted by S sub j. The way that the total amount of purchases is shared is a function of the size of each economy, denoted by E sub j, relative to the total size of the world economy. The next question then is, well, how do we define E sub j? Well, this is open to interpretation for economists, for macroeconomists, to decide what the formula should be. It's quite possible that E sub j could be the GDP of a nation state, or the M1 money supply, or some other suitable metric or combination of metrics. However, in the final analysis, the formula needs to share the purchases amongst the central banks so that it's equitable for all countries. Likely the best way to do this is to ensure that the monetary inflation that's created in each economy is equal on a percentage basis. If this is the case, then the policy should not distort exchange rates, and the effects of the policy should be neutralized from the perspective of stakeholders. Slide 4.6, ethics. It's very important to outline the social justification for this new policy. For example, with carbon taxes, the social justification is the polluter pays principle. But why would we, or how would we justify the global carbon reward in terms of morality and ethics? Here it is argued that the social justification should be framed in, or could be framed as, preventative insurance. That is, the policy itself is justified as a type of preventative insurance to ensure that the carbon balance for humanity remains in a relatively safe zone, and this will protect common pool resources, including the climate system and ecosystems. It will stabilise those resources, and it will also protect public goods, including cultural and biological heritage. The GCR policy is further justified on the basis that it does not impose any direct costs onto society, including stakeholders of citizens, businesses and governments. It does not force market actors to participate in the policy because the surface level agreements are voluntary and investors are open to trade in foreign exchange markets as they deem appropriate. And finally, the GCR policy can help stabilise the financial system, which is one of the objectives of central banking in the first place. Part 5, the expanded theory. This part of the presentation is very important because here I outline an expanded theory for both explaining and justifying the policy, and also explaining why the world has been unable to correct the market failure in carbon up until this time, noting that we just experienced COP28 in Dubai. So COP28 illustrates the problem of the climate crisis whereby governments, corporates, private sector, and so on are unable to come to a full agreement with financial mechanisms for resolving the climate crisis. So if we go to slide 5.1, let's consider this problem through the lens of the carbon pricing matrix. So first of all, let's remind ourselves what the matrix represents. It's a 2x2 matrix that proposes that there are 4 major social agreements that are possible for pricing carbon. These being the main ones. There may be hybrids and other minor versions, but these are the main ones. So we have 2 rows denoting carrots and sticks, whereby these are the only options really for store of value, either positive or negative pricing. And the 2 columns refer to the unit of account, the 2 main options being fiat or some carbon units of a new tradable instrument. If we focus our attention on boxes 1 and 3 on the left side, they refer to the Pigouvian tax and the Pigouvian subsidy and the negative and positive externalities respectively. The negative externality is already well defined. It's called the social cost of carbon. There is no positive externality that economists define explicitly, and so we'll just leave that point for now. If we go to cap and trade, it is another instrument that supposedly can be used to correct the negative externality, the social cost of carbon, through the instrument of an emissions permit that can be traded under the concept of Coasian bargaining. So we've introduced the carbon reward in quadrant 4. Its alternative name is mitigate and trade, and it introduces the carbon currency as the tradable instrument that will be traded with low cost, low friction, so that a Pareto optimality can be found in the marketplace for funding the mitigation we need. So the next question then is, from a theoretical perspective, why do we need the carbon reward, and what is it exactly correcting? What I argue is that Pigouvian externalities are actually limited as concepts because they only really deal with the behavior of market actors. In other words, they're socially framed. And what I argue is that there is another kind of externality that's been overlooked by economists, which refers to or is the product of the system itself, the economy itself as a system and as a structure which inhibits mitigation because it creates, in a sense, the rules of the game. I'll elaborate on this in the next slide. Slide 5.2, systemic market failure. In the previous slide, I made the point that the new theory, or the expanded theory, makes the claim that there is a new type of externalized cost that's been overlooked. Here, I provide the name of this externality. It's called a systemic externality. We might consider this the systemic externality hypothesis, if you like, and basically it's formalizing the notion that the market failure in carbon isn't just a social phenomena, but it's actually a systemic market failure that's the result of both human behavior and the structure of the economy, and we'll elaborate now on the features of this systemic market failure. So here is posited that Arthur C. Pigou's economic theory for externalized costs is insufficient for describing the market failure in carbon because his theory does not specifically account for the network effects of incumbent energy systems or the socio-economic frictions that resist decarbonization. So just to elaborate here, we could look at this systemic externality in two parts. One, the network effects of the energy we use. We are very dependent on fossil fuels because of the capital and the networks that are already in place and which we are reliant on. So it makes it difficult to decarbonize when the entire economy is so physically dependent on those systems. The socio-economic frictions relate to the energy supply, but it also makes reference to the monetary system itself, because our money supply is dominated by bank lending, commercial bank money, which is supported by loan agreements and mortgages that require that money to be paid back with interest. Because most of our money supply is debt-based, that drives market participants to seek profit. They must be profitable to survive, and thus they are also dependent indirectly on abundant cheap energy, which in current times is mostly fossil fuels. These network effects and frictions are collectively a systemic risk to the climate, biosphere and economy. It is claimed that the cost of managing this risk is an institutional cost, i.e. not a social cost, and so it's called a systemic externality. That's a very important point, just to clarify once more. We're not dealing with Pigouvian social costs, negative or positive externalities. This is an institutional cost because only governments and their institutions can actually structure the economy. Furthermore, Pigou's theory does not account for the coupling between money's purchasing power and energy, and more generally between carbon and energy. For those of you who might be interested in this point, there are studies that look at the correlation between total primary energy and global GDP or cumulative GDP, and they do find very high correlation. So the empirical data does show that purchasing power is coupled to energy, not surprising really, and since energy is bound to carbon at the molecular level, then it's obvious that money's purchasing power is also strongly correlated to carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So to continue, critically, his theory, that's Pigou's theory, does not account for the large energy requirement of carbon removal. Now this is another very important point because for thermodynamic reasons, carbon removal, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, will have always a high energy cost. It is therefore unlikely to be profitable in the marketplace today. Finally, Pigou's tax does not invite the intense cooperation that will be needed to decarbonize the world economy at a rapid pace. This last point is also very, very important because what it's actually referring to is game theory, really, in that it's known through experiments that carrots and sticks used together does solicit much more cooperation than just sticks or just carrots. And for this reason, The systemic market failure hypothesis and the theory that I'm presenting is not simply about energy, carbon, and currency types and profitability. It's also about the way human beings cooperate through the notion of carrot and stick incentives and game theory. Slide 5.3, Systemic Externality Hypothesis. Okay, now that we have considered the basic theory for the systemic externality, let's now formalize it with some diagrams to make it even more clear what the new expanded theory is saying. In this diagram, you can see on the left side is our carbon pricing matrix once again. And I'd just like to highlight that the economists, mainstream economists, generally they all agree that there is a negative externality called the social cost of carbon. That's shown in the graph as the yellow line. It's moving downwards because negative pricing in this chart is going down as tax. And the blue line is new. That's the representing the systemic externality, and it's going upwards because that particular externality, which I've previously defined, is corrected not with a tax but with the reward. What is the systemic externality in terms of quanta? Well, in fact, it's already been defined in the presentation as the XCC floor price. So just to remind ourselves, that's the expected market value at the marginal level for removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, such that the resulting removal will be the minimum required for a safe carbon balance. Noting also that the same instrument and price signal effectively can be used to also fund conventional mitigation as required. The name given to this price signal is the risk cost of carbon. And so formally, the systemic externality is quantified as the risk cost of carbon. Slide 5.4. Let's have another look at the systemic externality hypothesis to summarize the key findings. The negative externality, shown as the yellow curve, as I said earlier, that concept is essentially defined by anthropogenic. It's corrected with a carbon tax. The cost itself is socially framed. It refers to the economic welfare loss on people. The assessment is done using cost versus benefit analysis. It requires a damage function, in other words, some method of estimating economic damages or welfare loss into the future. And the economic value of both damages and benefits are time discounted. That's very important because time discounting requires a discount rate, a social discount rate, which in itself does also attract a certain level of confusion and debate over what the appropriate discount rate should be. Let's now shift our attention to the systemic externality, formally defined as the risk cost of carbon and is implemented as the carbon currency floor price. So the approach for correcting the systemic externality is Coasian. In other words, we allow the carbon currency to be traded in the forex market. Technically, it's a mitigate and trade policy. Importantly, the cost that's being represented is institutionally framed. Essentially, what we're saying, this is the cost that institutions need to manage because they are responsible for the structure of the global financial system. The way that the risk cost of carbon is quantified is based on risk management, or in other words, cost effectiveness. Probabilities are the focus, not damages. The reason being, we can't actually predict what the damages will be anyway when the climate system is becoming unstable and there could be all kinds of feedbacks in the system and nonlinear effects on ecosystems and so on. I think many people would agree now that the costs are highly unpredictable and thus we need to work more on probabilities. And finally, the policy, the way it's managed and implemented, is that the actions and activities are based on time horizons, not time discounting. As I explained in previous slides, the unit of account of the carbon currency is a 100-year duration, and that is effectively the time horizon for this mitigate and trade policy. Slide 5.5, how to correct the systemic market failure. Well, the key idea here is that we will need a carrot and stick approach to carbon pricing to finally correct the market failure that everybody's discussing. I'll summarise this with a statement as follows. The recommended resolution to the market failure in carbon is to correct the systemic externality by implementing a mitigate and trade policy called a carbon reward. The carbon reward should be deployed to finance a strategic global plan for achieving a relatively safe carbon balance. Radically improved cooperation, both top-down and bottom-up, is anticipated to occur when this carrot and stick approach is adopted. Now, those last statements are both very important and profound in my opinion, because what I'm arguing is that if we did implement the global carbon reward based on the central bank public finance guarantee, it would take the cost of mitigation off the balance sheet of major stakeholders, including citizens, businesses, and governments. It takes the cost out of fiscal budgets and puts it into the monetary system. Through this financial mechanism, humanity will be able to cooperate on rapid decarbonisation because they don't directly incur the cost. That's very important to understand. Also, combine that with the idea that by combining carrots with sticks, human cooperation can be maximised. I'd just like to add that there is more theory behind the policy, which, for reasons of brevity, I'm leaving out in this presentation. Well, thank you for staying with me through this presentation. This is the last section, part 6, where I'll describe a few examples of how the policy can be implemented. These examples illustrate the power of the policy, the kinds of mitigation projects that can be supported, new ways of funding and financing mitigation. So let's look at slide 6.1, energy asset exchanges. The goal here is to keep fossil fuels in the ground, particularly in places that there are other options, or where the fossil fuel extraction isn't really necessary, where it could be inefficient, or where there are important ecosystems, biodiversity, and the last remaining wild forests. So, by way of example, let's imagine an oil and gas lease in the Congo Basin, in the Congo peat forest, or perhaps in the Amazon forest. A country may be seeking to generate revenue because they would like to develop. In this case, we can offer the carbon reward. Perhaps there would be a list of reserves that might be prioritized, but nonetheless, we could organize this through a reverse auction. It would be voluntary, but we would offer the owners of the oil and gas leases a carbon reward payout that would be commensurate with the anticipated profits for those resources. A contract would need to be signed, call it a service level agreement, that would require the awardees to allocate most of their carbon rewards to the development of new renewable energy assets. It could be wind, solar, hydro, or some other sustainable, more sustainable form of renewable energy. These contracts would also require utility scale energy and also domestic scale energy, particularly where there are remote and rural communities that wouldn't necessarily be able to access grid power. The concept here is that we would give the recipient of the reward considerable flexibility to decide where in their country or in their region these new energy assets should be positioned. However, the general idea is that we kill two birds with one stone. We use the reward to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we then place conditions on how most of that reward finance should be spent, such that the benefits are transferred to these developing countries so that they have renewable energy and that they can skip the industrial revolution. There are a number of advantages that can be realised by developing countries. This includes the ability to receive the carbon currency as bankable, debt-free finance, which will help them avoid accumulating more debt, so they don't have to borrow to develop renewable energy. And it also empowers them to create for themselves energy supplies that are non-polluting or relatively non-polluting. Slide 6.2, rewards for aggregators. In this slide, we're going to look at an example of applying Rule 2, the rule for cleaner business. The example I chose is the decarbonisation of buildings around the world. The reason this particular example is presented is because it's a particularly challenging sector to decarbonise. But in actual fact, the Rule 2 for cleaner business can be applied to any industry in any sector other than energy supply. So, for instance, we could use the rule to decarbonise transportation, shipping, railways, cement production, steel production, any hard-to-abate industry. But let's focus our attention on buildings. Buildings produce about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, and urbanisation is a megatrend for the world, where more people are moving to cities to live and work. Buildings are difficult to manage for decarbonisation because their ownership is fragmented and the logistics can be complex. There are financial bottlenecks because of fragmented ownership and because of the different technologies that would need to be implemented. To address this kind of complex problem, we could use Rule 2 by setting bespoke formulas, bespoke baselines for each geographic region around the world, for each major city or town. So the bespoke formulas would set a retail reward for decarbonisation rates such that it takes into account the particular climate, the economy, the culture, and the kinds of buildings that are in each city or town. With a retail reward price, it would attract businesses, consultants that are specialised for decarbonisation to take charge of offering retail rewards to building owners for participating in decarbonisation, which could include such technologies as heat pumps, building insulation, or any other method that can decarbonise the building sector. Now, I'd just like to make the point that additionality will be taken care of through a test that requires the actual mass of carbon that will be avoided to be estimated, and to set conditions for the aggregators to make sure that they are achieving significant decarbonisation before they can receive the carbon reward. So this is an idea that's worth thinking about. If the world is serious about decarbonising buildings and cities, then this particular approach will provide liquidity, financial incentives, and funding for implementation of the latest technologies to decarbonise the building sector. Slide 6.3, rewards for carbon removal. Rule 3, as you will recall, is the reward rule for carbon removal. It's designed to create a new global market for carbon removal services where greenhouse gases are removed from the atmosphere at low concentration and then stored safely. This will be necessary if the world is to maintain a safe, relatively safe carbon balance because of residual emissions. This particular approach to managing anthropogenic greenhouse gases is politically contentious amongst some quarters, and this is because some people might view this as a tactic to perpetuate fossil fuel use. However, I would like to to emphasise that the policy is specifically designed to only price carbon removal to the level that is needed for the minimum safe amount of carbon removal at the global level. This amount will be required if we're to achieve a safe carbon balance. This is necessary in many respects for the holistic management of carbon emissions. If we don't have the capacity to remove greenhouse gases, then the risks increase that global warming could get much worse, driving positive feedback such as forest fires. The price signal that will be created will be predictable and long-term, as I had illustrated in previous slides, using what's called the XCC floor price. It will fund CO2 removal at scale, and projects that earn the reward under a service level agreement will be monitored on a rolling 100-year basis, such that their net emissions, their full life cycle emissions, will be taken into consideration. This will be important from the point of view that the carbon reward finance is scalable and bankable. That's critically important because significant carbon removal projects will have a high capital cost, and there's a need to attract a massive amount of investing into these kinds of projects, and also to attract a massive amount of research and development that will lower the cost of carbon removal over the long term. So currently there are a variety of technologies that are in development, research and development, including direct air capture, algal farming, and so on and so forth. The policy doesn't take a biased perspective on technologies. It simply allows the marketplace to provide the solutions, which could include natural methods such as reforestation, soil carbon capture. It could include engineered methods such as direct air capture, and hybrid methods on land and in the oceans. One last point I'd like to make about all the reward rules, rules 1, 2, and 3, is that projects that receive the carbon reward, they will be monitored periodically to make sure that their carbon accounting is updated. This is very important when projects have a risk of leaking carbon back to the atmosphere, such as with reforestation. Keeping in mind forests can be illegally logged, or they could burn down in wildfires. Should projects release carbon back into the atmosphere, then they will be obliged to pay back the equivalent amount of carbon rewards or carbon currency to the Carbon Exchange Authority. If projects cannot pay that back for reasons of default, they've become insolvent, the projects have broken down and shut down, there will be a problem whereby a certain amount of carbon currency is not matched by an appropriate amount of mitigated carbon. All of those projects and all of that overpaid carbon currency will be addressed with a process of negative interest rates being charged on all private holdings of carbon currency. So this is a way of correcting the entire balance sheet for the carbon currency at the global level, and it simply will be taken into account through a negative interest rate charge on all private holdings of XCC. Slide 6.4, Reward Adjustments for Co-Benefits. The Global Carbon Reward Policy includes 3 more rules called Rule 4, 5 and 6 to deal with the qualitative aspects of the carbon cycle. In other words, to deal with issues such as energy reliability, community well-being, and ecosystem health. These are critically important issues, and really it's referring to the objective of a just transition, a just clean energy transition for people all around the world, whether they live in developed countries or developing countries. Given that these rules have a lot of details behind them, I won't spend too much time in this presentation for reasons of brevity. I'll simply introduce these rules at a very high level, and we can come back to these rules at a future time in another presentation. So Rule 4, what it aims to do is improve the reliability of energy supplies during the energy transition. And the way this will be done is through stakeholder engagement, where people who consider themselves experts in the energy production and consumption, they will voluntarily join stakeholder groups to register their preferences for the design of energy systems. They will give their advice and register their preferences, and this information will be collected from a decentralized platform, which will then use that information to point score projects that are earning rewards under Rule 1, the reward rule for cleaner energy. Those projects and companies that do well in providing reliable energy will receive a higher score, and those that do poorly will receive a lower score. Then a certain amount of carbon currency will be reallocated based on these scores to create a secondary price signal to incentivize a more reliable energy system. And this is to help industries and businesses and households receive the kind of energy supply that they prefer. Rule 5 is similar. However, the objective of Rule 5 is to improve community well-being. This will involve decentralized platforms that will invite residents to register their preferences in terms of their quality of life, what kind of benefits they prefer to see, and what kind of harms they would like to avoid. And this information will be used to point score projects that do mitigation, and will then be used to redistribute carbon currency as a secondary price signal to incentivize co-benefits for communities. And finally, Rule 6 operates in a similar fashion, except the objective here is to protect biodiversity, improve ecosystem health. The stakeholders for this platform will most likely be scientists and land protectors, Indigenous people, those people who are regarded as being expert in understanding ecosystems. And they will be invited to provide their advice on what constitutes good projects, what kind of outcomes are preferred for ecosystem health. And then that information will be used to point score projects to incentivize mitigation projects to take into account ecosystem health. So that's a very brief, high-level introduction to Rules 4, 5, and 6. If you're interested in the details, consult the policy white paper, and in the future, we can explore these rules in more detail. If you have questions about the policy, please contact us via the email address given. We are seeking support from new partners. We need support to publish the white paper, promote the policy, and to demonstrate the policy. Thank you for your time.